Talk. The Second Derby Government. 1858. Extravagance and exaggeration of ideas are not the essential characteristic of either political party in this country. Both of them are composed in the main of men with English hearts and English feelings. Each of them comprises within itself far greater diversities of political principles and tendencies than can be noted as dividing the more moderate portion of the one from the more moderate portion of the other. But while the great English parties differ no more in their general outlines than by a somewhat varied distribution of the same elements in each, they are liable to be favorably or unfavorably affected and their essential characteristics unduly exaggerated, by circumstances of the order that would be termed accidental. Gladstone. The turn of the political wheel is constantly producing strange results, but none has ever been more strikingly dramatic than when, on February 20th, Brighton Milner Gibson, who had been ignominiously thrown out at Manchester the year before, had the satisfaction of walking to the table of the House of Commons as victorious tellers in the division on the conspiracy to murder bill that overthrew Lord Palmerston. A plot to slay the French Emperor had been organized by a band of Italian refugees in London. The bombs were manufactured in England. Orsini's design miscarried, but feeling in France was greatly excited, and the French government formally drew attention at St. James's to the fact that bodies of assassins abused our right of asylum. They hinted further that the amity of the Crown called for stronger law. Palmerston very sensibly did not answer the French dispatch, but introduced a bill with new powers against conspiracy. He in an instant became the most unpopular man in the country, and the idol of the year before was now hooted in the park. Lord Palmerston defeated. Mr. Gladstone was at first doubtful, but soon made up his mind. To Mrs. Gladstone he writes, February 17. As respects the conspiracy bill, you may depend upon our having plenty of fight. The result is doubtful, but if the bill gets into the House of Lords it will pass. Lord Aberdeen is strong against it. From him I went today to Lord Lyndhurst, and I found Lord Brougham with him. A most interesting conversation followed with these two wonderful old men at 80 and 86, coming next birthday, respectively, both in the fullest possession of their faculties, Brougham vehement, impulsive, full of gesticulation, and not a little rambling, the other calm and clear as a deep pool upon rock. Lord Lyndhurst is decidedly against the bill, Brougham somewhat inclines to it, being, as Lord Lyndhurst says, half a Frenchman. Lord Lyndhurst expounded the matter in a most luminous way from his point of view. Brougham went into raptures and used these words, I tell you what, Lyndhurst, I wish I could make an exchange with you. I would give you some of my walking power, and you should give me some of your brains. I have often told the story with this brief commentary, that the compliment was the highest I have ever known to be paid by one human being to another. 369. The debate showed a curious inversion of the parts usually played by eminent men. Palmerston vainly explained that he was doing no more than international comedy required, and doing no worse than placing the foreign refugee on the same footing in respect of certain offences as the British subject. Mr. Gladstone, February 19, on the other hand, as one who has perhaps too often made it his business to call attention to the failings of his countrymen, contended that if national honour was not henceforth to be a shadow and a name, it was the paramount, absolute, and imperative duty of Her Majesty's ministers to protest against the imputation upon us of favour for assassination, a plant which is congenial neither to our soil nor to the climate in which we live. 370. One of the truest things said in the debate was Disraeli's incidental observation that the House should remember that in 99 cases out of 100, when there is a quarrel between two states, it is generally occasioned by some blunder of a ministry. Mr. Disraeli perhaps consoled himself by the pithy saying of Baron Bruno, that if no one made any blunders, there would be no politics. The blood of the Civis Romanus, however, was up, and Palmerston, defeated by a majority of 19, at once resigned. Correspondence with Lord Derby. Lord Derby, whose heart had failed him 3 years earlier, now formed his second administration, and made one more attempt to bring Mr. Gladstone over to the Conservative ranks. Lord Lansdowne had told the Queen that no other government was possible, and an hour after he had kissed hands the new Prime Minister applied to Mr. Gladstone. The decisions taken by him in answer to this and another application 3 months later mark one more of the curious turning points in his career and in the fate of his party. February 20, 1858. Dined at Herbert's with Graham. We sat till 12:30, but did not talk quite through the crisis. Palmerston has resigned. He is down. I must now cease to denounce him. 21. St. James's morning, and Holy Communion. Westminster Abbey in evening, when I sat by Sir George Grey. From St. James's I went to Lord Aberdeen's. There Derby's letter reached me. We sent for Herbert and I wrote an answer. Graham arrived and heard it. With slight modifications it went. The case, though grave, was not doubtful. Made 2 copies and went off before 6 with S. Herbert. We separated for the evening with the fervent wish that in public life we might never part. 2 or 3 letters exhibit the situation. Lord Derby to Mr. Gladstone. St. James's Square, February 21, 1858. In consequence of the adverse vote of the other night, in which you took so prominent and distinguished a part, the government, as you know, has resigned, and I have been entrusted by the Queen with the difficult task, which I have felt it my duty not to decline, of forming an administration. In doing so, I am very desirous, if possible, of obtaining the cooperation of men of eminence, who are not at this moment fettered by other ties, and whose principles are not incompatible with my own. Believing that you stand in this position, it would afford me very great satisfaction if I could obtain your valuable aid in forming my proposed cabinet, and if I should be so fortunate as to do so, I am sure there would be on all hands a sincere desire to consult your wishes, as far as possible, as to the distribution of offices. I would willingly include Sidney Herbert in this offer, but I fear he is too intimately associated with John Russell to make it possible for him to accept. Mr. Gladstone to Lord Derby. 10, Great George Street, February 21, 1851. I am very sensible of the importance of the vote taken on Friday, and I should deeply lament to see the House of Commons trampled on in consequence of that vote. The honor of the House is materially involved in giving it full effect. It would therefore be my first wish to aid, if possible, in such a task, and remembering the years when we were colleagues, I may be permitted to say that there is nothing in the fact of your being the head of a ministry, which would avail to deter me from forming part of it. Among the first questions I have had to put to myself, in consequence of the offer which you have conveyed in such friendly and flattering terms, has been the question whether it would be in my power by accepting it, either alone or in concert with others, to render you material service. After the long years during which we have been separated, there would be various matters of public interest requiring to be noticed between us, but the question I have mentioned is a needful preliminary. Upon the best consideration which the moment allows, I think it plain that alone, as I must be, I could not render you service worth your having. The dissolution of last year excluded from Parliament men with whom I had sympathies, and it in some degree affected the position of those political friends with whom I have now for many years been united through evil and, much more rarely, through good report. Those who lament the rupture of old traditions may well desire the reconstitution of a party, but the reconstitution of a party can only be effected, if at all, by the return of the old influences to their places, and not by the junction of an isolated person. The difficulty is even enhanced in my case by the fact that in your party, reduced as it is at the present moment in numbers, there is a small but active and not unimportant section who avowedly regard me as the representative of the most dangerous ideas. I should thus, unfortunately, be to you a source of weakness in the heart of your own adherents, while I should bring you no party or group of friends to make up for their defection or discontent. For the reasons which I have thus stated or glanced at, my reply to your letter must be in the negative. I must, however, add that a government formed by you at this time will, in my opinion, have strong claims upon me, and upon anyone situated as I am, for favorable presumptions, and in the absence of conscientious difference on important questions, for support. I have had an opportunity of seeing Lord Aberdeen and Sidney Herbert, and they fully concur in the sentiments I have just expressed. Letter from Mr. Bright. Mr. Gladstone had no close personal or political ties with the Manchester men at this moment, but we may well believe that a sagacious letter from Mr. Bright made its mark upon his meditations. Mr. Bright to Mr. Gladstone. Reform Club, February 21, 58. Coming down Park Lane just now, I met a leading lawyer of Lord Derby's party, who will doubtless be in office with him if he succeeds in forming a government. He told me that Lord Derby and his friends were expecting to be able to induce you to join them. Will you forgive me if I write to you on this matter? I say nothing but in the most friendly spirit, and I have some confidence that you will not misinterpret what I am doing. Lord Derby has only about 1/3 of the House of Commons with him, and it is impossible by any management, or by any dissolution, to convert this minority into a majority. His minority in the House is greater and more powerful than it is in the country, and any appeal to the country, now or hereafter, must, I think, leave him in no better position than that in which he now finds himself. The whole Liberal party in the country dislike him, and they dislike his former leader in the Commons, and notoriously his own party in the country, and in the House, have not much confidence in him. There is no party in the country to rally round him, as Peel was supported in 1841. A Derby government can only exist upon forbearance, and will only last till it is convenient for us and the Whigs to overthrow it. Lord Palmerston may give it his support for a time, but he can give it little more than his own vote and speeches, for the Liberal constituencies will not forgive their members if they support it. If you join Lord Derby, you link your fortunes with a constant minority, and with a party in the country which is every day lessening in numbers and in power. If you remain on our side of the House, you are with the majority, and no government can be formed without you. You have many friends there, and some who would grieve much to see you leave them, and I know nothing that can prevent your being Prime Minister before you approach the age of every other member of the House who has or can have any claim to that high office. If you agree rather with the men opposite than with those among whom you have been sitting of late, I have nothing to say. I am sure you will follow where the right leads, if you only discover it, and I am not hoping or wishing to keep you from the right. I think I am not mistaken in the opinion I have formed of the direction in which your views have for some years been tending. You know well enough the direction in which the opinions of the country are tending. The minority which invites you to join it, if honest, must go or wish to go, in an opposite direction, and it cannot therefore govern the country. Will you unite yourself with what must be, from the beginning, an inevitable failure? Don't be offended, if, by writing this, I seem to believe you will join Lord Derby. I don't believe it, but I can imagine you're seeing the matter from a point of view very different to mine, and I feel a strong wish just to say to you what is passing in my mind. You will not be the less able to decide on your proper course. If I thought this letter would annoy you, I would not send it. I think you will take it in the spirit in which it is written. No one knows that I am writing it, and I write it from no idea of personal advantage to myself, but with a view to yours, and to the interests of the country. I may be mistaken, but think I am not. Don't think it necessary to reply to this. I only ask you to read it, and to forgive me the intrusion upon you, and further to believe that I am yours, with much respect. Mr. Gladstone to Mr. Bright. 10, Great George Street, February 22, 58. Your letter can only bear one construction, that of an act of peculiar kindness which ought not to be readily forgotten. For anyone in whom I might be interested, I should earnestly desire, upon his entering public life, that, if possible, he might with a good conscience end in the party where he began, or else that he might have broad and definite grounds for quitting it. When neither of these advantages appears to be certainly within command, there remains a strong and paramount consolation in seeking, as we best can, the truth and the public interests, and I think it a marked instance of liberality, that you should give me credit for keeping this object in my view. My seeking, however, has not on the present occasion been very difficult. The opinions, such as they are, that I hold on many questions of government and administration are strongly held, and although I set a value, and a high value, upon the power which office gives, I earnestly hope never to be tempted by its exterior allurements, unless they are accompanied with the reasonable prospect of giving effect to some at least of those opinions and with some adequate opening for public good. On the present occasion I have not seen such a prospect, and before I received your letter yesterday afternoon I had made my choice. This ended the first scene of the short fifth act. The new government was wholly conservative. 2. Uneasiness of friends. Throughout the whole of this period, Mr. Gladstone's political friends were uneasy about him. He writes and says and does too much, Graham had told Lord Aberdeen, December 1856, and a year and a half later the same correspondent notices a restless anxiety for a change of position, though at Gladstone's age and with his abilities he could not wonder at it. Mr. Gladstone was now approaching 50, Graham was nearer 70 than 60, and Aberdeen drawing on to 75. One of the most eminent of his friends confessed that he was amazed at a man of Gladstone's high moral sense of feeling being able to bear with Dizzy. I can only account for it on the supposition, which I suppose to be the true one, that personal dislike and distrust of Palmerston is the one absorbing feeling with him. I see no good ground for the violent personal prejudice which is the sole ruling motive of Gladstone's and Graham's course, especially when the alternative is such a man as Dizzy. Then comes some angry language about that enigmatic personage which at this cooling distance of time need not here be transcribed. At the end of 1856 Lord Aberdeen told Mr. Gladstone that his position in the House was very peculiar. With an admitted superiority of character and intellectual power above any other member, I fear that you do not really possess the sympathy of the House at large, while you have incurred the strong dislike of a considerable portion of Lord Derby's followers. Things grew worse rather than better. Even friendly journalists in the spring of 1858 wrote of him as the most signal example that the present time affords of the man of speculation misplaced and lost in the labyrinth of practical politics. They call him the chief orator and the weakest man in the House of Commons. He has exhibited at every stage traces of an unhappy incoherence which is making him a mere Bedouin of Parliament, a noble being full of spirit and power, but not to be tamed into the ordinary ways of civil life. His sympathies hover in hopeless inconsistency between love for righteous national action, good government, freedom, social and commercial reform, and a hankering after a strong, unassailable executive in the old obstructive Tory sense. He protests against unfair dealing with the popular voice in the principalities on the Danube, but when the popular voice on the Thames demands higher honors for General Havelock he resists it with the doctrine that the executive should be wholly free to distribute honors as it pleases. He is loudly indignant against the supersession of Parliament by diplomacy, but when a motion is made directly pointing to the rightful influence of the House over foreign affairs, he neither speaks nor votes. Is it not clear beyond dispute that his cannot be the will to direct, nor the wisdom to guide the party of progress out of which the materials for the government of this country will have to be chosen? 371. In organs supposed to be inspired by Disraeli, Mr. Gladstone's fate is pronounced in different terms, but with equal decision. In phrases that must surely have fallen from the very lips of the oracle itself, the public was told that cerebral natures, men of mere intellect without moral passion, are quite unsuited for governing mankind. The days of the mere dialectician are over, and the rulers of Christendom are no longer selected from the serfs of Aristotle. Without the emotions that soar and thrill and enkindle, no man can attain a grand moral vision. When Mr. Gladstone aims at philosophy, he only reaches casuistry. He reasons like one of the sons of Ignatius Loyola. What their society is to the Jesuit, his own individualism is to Mr. Gladstone. He supports his own interests as much from intellectual zeal as from self-love. A shrewd observer is quoted, looking on Mr. Gladstone and Mr. Sidney Herbert sitting side by side, the former with his rather saturnine face and straight black hair, and the latter eminently handsome, with his bright, cold smile and subtlety of aspect. I have often thought that I was beholding the Jesuit of the closet really devout, and the Jesuit of the world, ambitious, artful, and always on the watch for making his rapier thrusts. Mr. Gladstone, in a word, is extremely eminent, but strangely eccentric, a simian stylites among the statesmen of his time. 372. Renewed proposal of office. In May, an important vacancy occurred in the ministerial ranks by Lord Ellenborough's resignation of the presidency of the Board of Control. This became the occasion of a renewed proposal to Mr. Gladstone. He tells the story in a memorandum prepared, May 22, for submission to Aberdeen and Graham, whom Lord Derby urged him to consult. Memorandum by Mr. Gladstone submitted to Lord Aberdeen and Sir James Graham. May 22, 58. Secret. Last week, after Mr. Cardwell's notice but before the debate began, Mr. Walpole, after previously sounding Sir William Heathcote to a similar effect, called me aside in the lobby of the House of Commons and inquired whether I could be induced to take office. I replied that I thought that question put by him of his own motion, as he had described it, was one that I could hardly answer. It seemed plain, I said, that the actual situation was one so entirely belonging to the government as it stood, that they must plainly work through it unchanged, that the head of the government was the only person who could make a proposal or put a question about taking office in it. I added, however, that my general views were the same as in February. This morning I had a note from Walpole asking for an appointment, and he called on me at 4 o'clock accordingly. He stated that he came by authority of Lord Derby to offer me the Board of Control or, if I preferred it, the Colonial Office. That he had told Lord Derby I should, he thought, be likely to raise difficulties on 2 points: first, the separation from those who have been my friends in public life; secondly, the leadership of the House of Commons. I here interrupted him to say it must be in his option to speak or to be silent on the latter of these subjects. It was one which had never been entertained or opened by me in connection with this subject, since the former of the 2 points had offered an absolute preliminary bar to the acceptance of office. He, however, explained himself as follows: that Mr. Disraeli had stated his willingness to surrender the leadership to Sir James Graham, if he were disposed to join the government, but that the expressions he had used in his speech of Thursday, 373, apparently those with respect to parties in the House and to office, seemed to put it beyond the right of the government to make any proposal to him. He at the same time spoke in the highest terms not only of the speech, but of the position in which he thought it placed Sir James Graham, and he left me to infer that there would have been, but for the cause named, a desire to obtain his cooperation as leader of the House of Commons. With respect to the proposal as one the acceptance of which would separate me from my friends, he hoped it was not so. It was one made to me alone, the immediate vacancy being a single one, but the spirit in which it was made was a desire that it should be taken to signify the wish of the government progressively to extend its basis, as far as it could be effected compatibly with consistency in its opinions. He added that judging from the past he hoped he might assume that there was no active opposition to the government on the part of my friends, naming Lord Aberdeen, Sir James Graham, and the Duke of Newcastle. I told him with respect to the leadership that I thought it handsome on the part of Mr. Disraeli to offer to waive it on behalf of Sir James Graham, that it was a subject which did not enter into my decision for the reason I had stated, and I hinted also that it was one on which I could never negotiate or make stipulations. It was true, I said, I had no broad differences of principle from the party opposite. On the whole perhaps I differed more from Lord Palmerston than from almost anyone, and this was more on account of his temper and views of public conduct, than of any political opinions. Nay more, it would be hard to show broad differences of public principle between the government and the bench opposite. Renewed proposal of office. I said, however, that in my view the proposal which he had made to me could not be entertained. I felt the personal misfortune and public inconvenience of being thrown out of party connection, but a man at the bottom of the well must not try to get out, however disagreeable his position, until a rope or a ladder is put down to him. In this case my clear opinion was that by joining the government I should shock the public sentiment and should make no essential, no important, change in their position. I expressed much regret that accidental causes had kept back from my view at the critical moment the real extent of Lord Derby's proposals in February, that I answered him then as an individual with respect to myself individually. I could not separate from those with whom I had been acting all my life long, in concert with whom all the habits of my mind and my views of public affairs had been formed, to go into what might justly be called a cabinet of strangers, since it contained no man to whom I had ever been a colleague, with the single exception of Lord Derby, and that 12 or 14 years ago. While I did not conceive that public feeling would or ought to approve this separation, on the other hand I felt that my individual junction would and could draw no material accession of strength to the cabinet. He made the marked admission that if my acceptance must be without the approval of friends, that must undoubtedly be an element of great weight in the case. This showed clearly that Lord Derby was looking to me in the first place, and then to others beyond me. He did not, however, found upon this any request, and he took my answer as an absolute refusal. His tone was, I need not say, very cordial, and I think I have stated all that was material in the conversation, except that he signified they were under the belief that Herbert entertained strong personal feelings towards Disraeli. Returning home, however, at 7 this evening I found a note from Walpole expressing Lord Derby's wish in the following words, that before you finally decide on refusing to accept the offer he has made either of the colonies or of the India Board, he wishes you would consult Sir James Graham and Lord Aberdeen. In order to meet this wish, I have put down the foregoing statement. Lord Aberdeen agreed with Mr. Gladstone that on the whole the balance inclined to no. Graham, in an admirable letter, truly worthy of a wise, affectionate, and faithful friend, said, my judgment is, on this occasion, balanced like your own. He ran through the catalogue of Mr. Gladstone's most intimate political friends. The result was that he stood alone. Fixed party ties and active official duties would conduce to his present happiness and his future fame. He might form an intimate alliance with Lord Derby with perfect honor. His natural affinities were strong, and his honest liberal tendencies would soon leaven the whole lump and bring it into conformity with the shape and body of the times. As for the leadership in the Commons, Graham had once thought that for Gladstone to sit on the Treasury bench with Disraeli for his leader would be humiliation and dishonour. Later events had qualified this opinion. Of course, the abdication of Disraeli could not be made a condition precedent, but the concession would somehow be made, and in the Commons preeminence would be Gladstone's, be the conditions what they might. In fine, time was wearing fast away, Gladstone had reached the utmost vigour of his powers, and present opportunities were not to be neglected in vain expectation of better. 3. Letter from Mr. Disraeli. Before this letter of Graham's arrived, an unexpected thing happened, and Mr. Disraeli himself advanced to the front of the stage. His communication, which opens and closes without the usual epistolary forms, just as it is reproduced here, marks a curious episode, and sheds a strange light on that perplexing figure. Mr. Disraeli to Mr. Gladstone. Confidential. I think it of such paramount importance to the public interests, that you should assume at this time a commanding position in the administration of affairs, that I feel it a solemn duty to lay before you some facts, that you may not decide under a misapprehension. Our mutual relations have formed the great difficulty in accomplishing a result, which I have always anxiously desired. Listen, without prejudice, to this brief narrative. In 1850, when the balanced state of parties in the House of Commons indicated the future, I endeavoured, through the medium of the late Lord Londonderry, and for some time not without hope, to induce Sir James Graham to accept the post of leader of the Conservative Party, which I thought would remove all difficulties. When he finally declined this office, I endeavoured to throw the game into your hands, and your conduct then, however unintentional, assisted me in my views. The precipitate ministry of 1852 baffled all this. Could we have postponed it another year, all might have been right? Nevertheless, notwithstanding my having been forced publicly into the chief place in the Commons, and all that occurred in consequence, I was still constant to my purpose, and in 1855 suggested that the leadership of the House should be offered to Lord Palmerston, entirely with the view of consulting your feelings and facilitating your position. Some short time back, when the power of dissolution was certain, and the consequences of it such as, in my opinion, would be highly favourable to the Conservative Party, I again confidentially sought Sir James Graham, and implored him to avail himself of the favorable conjuncture, accept the post of leader in the H.of.C., and allow both of us to serve under him. He was more than kind to me, and fully entered into the state of affairs, but he told me his course was run, and that he had not strength or spirit for such an enterprise. Thus you see, for more than 8 years, instead of thrusting myself into the foremost place, I have been, at all times, actively prepared to make every sacrifice of self for the public good, which I have ever thought identical with your accepting office in a conservative government. Don't you think the time has come when you might deign to be magnanimous? Mr. Canning was superior to Lord Castlereagh in capacity, in acquirements, in eloquence, but he joined Lord C. when Lord C. was Lord Liverpool's lieutenant, when the state of the Tory party rendered it necessary. That was an enduring, and, on the whole, not an unsatisfactory connection, and it certainly terminated very gloriously for Mr. Canning. I may be removed from the scene, or I may wish to be removed from the scene. Every man performs his office, and there is a power, greater than ourselves, that disposes of all this. The conjuncture is very critical, and if prudently yet boldly managed, may rally this country. To be inactive now is, on your part, a great responsibility. If you join Lord Derby's cabinet, you will meet there some warm personal friends, all its members are your admirers. You may place me in neither category, but in that, I assure you, you have ever been sadly mistaken. The vacant post is, at this season, the most commanding in the Commonwealth. If it were not, whatever office you filled, your shining qualities would always render you supreme, and if party necessities retain me formally in the chief post, the sincere and delicate respect which I should always offer you, and the unbounded confidence, which on my part, if you choose you could command, would prevent your feeling my position is anything but a form. Think of all this in a kindly spirit. These are hurried lines, but they are heartfelt. I was in the country yesterday, and must return there today for a county dinner. My direction is Langley Park, Slough. But on Wednesday evening I shall be in town, not be a Disraeli. Grosvenor Gate, May 25, 1858. None of us, I believe, were ever able to persuade Mr. Gladstone to do justice to Disraeli's novels, the spirit of whim in them, the ironic solemnity, the historical paradoxes, the fantastic glitter of dubious gems, the grace of high comedy, all in union with a social vision that often pierced deep below the surface. In the comparative stiffness of Mr. Gladstone's reply on this occasion, I seem to hear the same accents of guarded reprobation. Mr. Gladstone to Mr. Disraeli. 11, Carlton House Terrace, May 25, 58. My dear Sir, the letter you have been so kind as to address to me will enable me, I trust, to remove from your mind some impressions with which you will not be sorry to part. You have given me a narrative of your conduct since 1850 with reference to your position as leader of your party. But I have never thought your retention of that office matter of reproach to you, and on Saturday last I acknowledged to Mr. Walpole the handsomeness of your conduct in offering to resign it to Sir James Graham. You consider that the relations between yourself and me have proved the main difficulty in the way of certain political arrangements. Will you allow me to assure you that I have never in my life taken a decision which turned upon those relations? You assure me that I have ever been mistaken in failing to place you among my friends or admirers. Again I pray you to let me say that I have never known you penurious in admiration towards anyone who had the slightest claim to it, and that at no period of my life, not even during the limited one when we were in sharp political conflict, have I either felt any enmity towards you, or believed that you felt any towards me. At the present moment I am awaiting counsel which at Lord Derby's wish I have sought. But the difficulties which he wishes me to find means of overcoming, are broader than you may have supposed. Were I at this time to join any government I could not do it in virtue of party connections. I must consider then what are the conditions which make harmonious and effective cooperation in cabinet possible, how largely old habits enter into them, what connections can be formed with public approval, and what change would be requisite in the constitution of the present government, in order to make any change worth a trial. I state these points fearlessly and without reserve, for you have yourself well reminded me that there is a power beyond us that disposes of what we are in due, and I find the limits of choice in public life to be very narrow. I remain, etc. The Second Derby Government. The next day Mr. Gladstone received Graham's letter already described. The interpretation that he put upon it was that although Graham appeared to lean in favor of acceptance, yet the council was indecisive. On ordinary construction, though the councillors said that this was a case in which only the man himself could decide, yet he also said that acceptance would be for the public good. Your affirmative advice, had it even been more positive, was not approval, nor was Lord Aberdeen's. On the contrary, it would have been like the orders to Balaam, that he should go with the messengers of Balak, when notwithstanding the command, the act was recorded against him. We may be quite sure that when a man draws all these distinctions, between affirmative advice, positive advice, approval, he is going to act without any advice at all, as Mr. Gladstone was in so grave a case bound to do. He declined to join. Mr. Gladstone to Lord Derby. Private. 11 CH Terrace, May 26, 58. I have this morning received Sir James Graham's reply, and I have seen Lord Aberdeen before and since. Their counsel has been given in no narrow or unfriendly spirit. It is, however, indecisive, and leaves upon me the responsibility which they would have been glad if it had been in their power to remove. I must therefore adhere to the reply which I gave to Mr. Walpole on Saturday, for I have not seen, and I do not see, a prospect of public advantage or of material accession to your strength, from my entering your government single-handed. Had it been in your power to raise fully the question whether those who were formerly your colleagues could again be brought into political relation with you, I should individually have thought it to be for the public good that, under the present circumstances of the country, such a scheme should be considered deliberately and in a favorable spirit. But I neither know that this is in your power, nor can I feel very sanguine hopes that the obstacles in the way of this proposal on the part of those whom it would embrace, could be surmounted. Lord Aberdeen is the person who could best give a dispassionate and weighty opinion on that subject. For me the question, confined as it is to myself, is a narrow one, and I am bound to say that I arrive without doubt at the result. Refusal. I hope and trust, said Graham, when he knew what Mr. Gladstone had done, that you have decided rightly. My judgment inclined the other way. I should be sorry if your letter to Lord Derby led him to make any more extended proposal. It could not possibly succeed, as matters now stand, and the abortive attempt would be injurious to him. The reconstruction of the fossil remains of the old Peel party is a hopeless task. No human power can now reanimate it with the breath of life. It is decomposed into atoms and will be remembered only as a happy accident, while it lasted. 374. 4. Suez Canal. In one remarkable debate of this summer the solitary statesman descended from his pillar. Now was the time of the memorable scheme for the construction of the Suez Canal, that first emanated from the French group of Saint-Simonian visionaries in the earlier half of the century. Their dream had taken shape in the fertile and persevering genius of Lesseps, and was at this time the battleground of engineers, statesmen, and diplomatists in every country in Europe. For 15 years the British government had used all their influence at Constantinople to prevent the Sultan from sanctioning the project. In June a motion of protest was made in the House of Commons. Lord Palmerston persisted that the scheme was the greatest bubble that ever was imposed upon the credulity and simplicity of the people of this country. The public meetings on its behalf were got up by a pack of foreign projectors. Traffic by the railway would always beat traffic by steamer through the canal. It would be a step towards the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire. It would tend to dismember our own empire by opening a passage between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, which would be at the command of other nations and not at ours. Away, then, with such a sacrifice of the interest of Great Britain to philanthropic schemes and philosophic reveries. So much for the sound practical man. Mr. Gladstone followed. Don't let us, he said, have governments and ex-governments coming down to instruct us here on bubble schemes. As a commercial project, let the Suez Canal stand or fall upon commercial grounds.
With close reasoning, he argued against the proposition that the canal would tend to sever Turkey from Egypt.
As to possible danger to our own interests, was it not a canal that would fall within the control of the strongest maritime power in Europe? And what could that power be but ourselves? Finally, what could be more unwise than to present ourselves to the world as the opponents of a scheme on the face of it beneficial to mankind, on no better ground than remote and contingent danger to interests of our own, with the alleged interest of Turkey merely thrust hypocritically in for the purpose of justifying a policy purely narrow-minded and wholly selfish? The majority against the motion was large, as it was in the case of the 7 cardinals against Galileo. Still the canal was made, with some very considerable consequences that were not foreseen either by those who favored it or those who mocked it as a bubble. M. de Lesseps wrote to Mr. Gladstone from Constantinople that the clearness of his speech had enabled him to use it with good effect in his negotiations with the Porte. Your eloquent words, the authority of your name, and the consideration that attaches to your character, have already contributed much and will contribute more still to hinder the darkening and complication of a question of itself perfectly clear and simple, and to avoid the troubling of the relations between two countries of which it is the natural mission to hold aloft together the flag of modern civilization. Mr. Gladstone took an active interest in the various measures, some of them extremely singular, proposed by Mr. Disraeli for the transfer of the government of India from the Company to the Crown. Writing early in the year to Sir James Graham, he argued that their object should be steadily and vigorously to resist all attempts at creating a monster military and civil patronage, and to insist upon a real check on the Indian minister. He had much conversation with Mr. Bright, not then an intimate acquaintance, on the difficulty of the problem to govern a people by a people. The two agreed strongly as to one prominent possibility of mischief. They both distrusted the discretion confided to the Indian minister in the use of the Indian army. Mr. Gladstone set a mark upon the bill by carrying a clause to provide that the Indian army should not be employed beyond the frontiers of India without the permission of Parliament. This clause he privately hoped would afford a standing ground from which a control might be exercised on future Palmerstons.